Is it your New Year's resolution to get into filmmaking? Maybe you're starting a YouTube channel, you're just trying to get into the craft, you're trying to level up your visuals, but they're not looking exactly how you envision them when you're planning them out. This video is going to help you understand the basics for the cinematographer's bread and butter, the talking head shot. So the first thing we're going to look at is your camera settings, and yes, we are going way back into basics for this. I've had so many questions about how do you get into video or where do you even start? It's here. And the first setting we're going to look at is shutter speed. Ideally, you want your shutter speed to be double your frame rate, and this is just so you get the most natural and organic looking motion in your image as possible. A lower shutter speed can mean you'll get weird motion blur throughout your image, and a high shutter speed means you don't get any motion blur at all, which can be really good for action sequences, but for a talking head, not so much. The next setting we're going to look at is your camera's ISO, or ISO, and ideally you want to keep this as low as possible or at your camera's base ISO level. I'm on the Sony a7S III, so the base level is 640. Without getting too technical, ISO determines how sensitive your camera sensor is to light, but it also shifts the noise floor, so you want to keep it as low as possible if you want those cleaner shadows. And the last camera setting we're going to look at is your lens's aperture, and this can be dialed into taste depending on how much depth of field you want. If you want lots of depth of field, you'll have a high f-stop, and if you want a shallow depth of field, you'll have a small f-stop. All of the settings we've just talked about are part of what's called the exposure triangle. They all affect how much light is let into your camera's sensor in some way or another, so you need to kind of meet them in the middle somewhere or work them in a way to get as much light as you can. And while the settings for a talking head might not be the same for every single situation across the board, it's a good foundation to learn so you know when you can break those rules or change them creatively. The next thing to consider is where you're placing your camera in the space, or your composition. If you think about watching a video online, or at the cinema or anything like that, you're essentially watching a flat surface, so it's our job as the cinematographers to create the depth in the scene. The easiest and most tried and tested method of this is to shoot into the L or corner of the room. Of course, this is all largely dictated by the narrative or how you want your audience to feel when they're watching your film or YouTube video, but understanding the rules will help you break the rules, as I said earlier. This brings us to lighting, which is arguably the most important thing about any video. More important than what camera you're using, maybe not as important as audio, but that's for another video. But without lighting, your video would look like this. Bit dark, innit? In this example, you can see I'm in the corner or the L of the room, just to get as much depth as possible, and there's some windows behind me just to help motivate any lights that we would bring in that would help shape our image. So we've got our camera settings all dialed in, they're exactly the same as I mentioned earlier, but as you can see, the image is way overexposed. And there's a few ways we can help to control this. We could add some ND gels to the windows, which would help bring down the light level coming in. But if you're not allowed to put it on there, or you just don't want to put gels up, it is pretty time consuming. We could also increase the aperture in our lens, but that would increase the depth of field in your image, and maybe you don't want to see everything super tack sharp. Maybe you want the background to fall off out of focus a little bit. So we're not going to do that either. The third option would be to use a ND filter. Think of it like sunglasses for your lens. So we've got the ND filter on now, and we've brought detail back outside the window, which is great, but now we've got a new problem. I'm underexposed. You can't see me. So the first light we're going to bring in is the SmallRig 350D, and if you've already ND'd down your image, you're already it's not underexposing, but you're going to need more output to bring the level back up. So this is the strongest light I've got, and if you are trying to fight against daylight, you're going to need a strong light. So I'm going to position this light on the far side of my face, or the side that's farthest away from camera. This is just so you can still get the shadow side of my face closer to the camera, and that's going to create more depth in the image. I'm also using a big softbox, I think it's like 42 inch or something like that, but the bigger the softbox, the more even and nicer wrap of light you're going to get, and I'm also using a grid on top of that just to control any spill to stop it from going all over the scene. Yes, there are white walls in the space and that's going to introduce bounce, but the grid is going to help control that a little bit more. And to monitor my exposure, I'm using a monitor that has EL zone on it, and all that does is tells you how bright and how dark parts of your image are. It's way quicker and way more efficient than trying to eyeball it and it'll save you so much time. So if you are getting into lighting or cinematography, the first thing you need to really buy is a monitor that does this. But to be fair, I think you can get apps for free that do this as well, or fairly cheap. I'll link some below. And notice how my key light isn't actually brighter than what's happening outside. It's just about at the same level, which is the best way to motivate lights and keep things looking as natural as possible. If we did have it brighter than what's happening outside, it would be very obvious that we've set up a light just outside the frame. For the best skin tone reproduction, I would say you want your skins to be living in that yellow kind of space if you are using EL Zone. If you're using false color or anything else, it does change, but as a general rule of thumb, you want to be 1 or 2 stops over middle grey. And you could leave it there. I think it looks great, but depending on if you're doing corporate work or maybe you do just want to lift up the overall ambience of the scene, you could increase the room tone. And to do that, all I'm going to do is bring in another light and I'm going to bounce it off the ceiling, which is going to create an even spread of light and just fill in all the little gaps and nooks and crannies without overpowering your key. And you can see here, I'm just turning the light off and on with side async, trying to make sure the level is where I need it to be, instead of going up to the actual fixture itself and fiddling with the control box. It just saves time and I can spend more time looking at my monitor instead of having to wander off and sort lights out elsewhere. And from here you could add a hair light, you could add practicals to introduce colour contrast, or you can control light further by adding negative fill. I think it's so easy to overcomplicate, especially when you're first getting into leveling up your visuals or cinematography, in thinking, I need all the lights, I need everything possible to make this look good, when in reality all you need is to think about how can I balance this image in the best and most efficient way possible. You don't need to be spending thousands on a super nice camera and the most expensive lights possible. It's just not necessary, especially if you are just doing YouTube videos. In this example, I know the lights are a little bit overkill, and chances are you're not going to be dealing with strong backlit sun. It's just a bit daft, but it's just to show you that it is possible. And if you understand the relationship between lighting and how it exists in the space, how it interacts with your camera, you can transfer what you've learned in this video to any setup imaginable, and it's just something that you're going to double down on and hone in on as you develop your skills. In short, don't clip your highlights and don't crush your shadows. If you want that look, let it happen in post. If it is too bright, bring in an ND filter. If it's too dark, consider bringing the level up with lights. That's it, and I hope you learned something. If you did, please consider liking this video, subscribe to the channel, and I shall see you in the next one. Peace.